everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be taking a look at Something City by Ellice Weaver. This is put out by Avery Hill Publishing. I absolutely fell in love with Ellice Weaver's work with her new release this year called Big Ugly, and had to go find if there was anything else that this artist had put out. And thankfully there was one more book that I could get a hold of called Something City. I finally got around to reading this. And yeah, Ellice Weaver is a real master of comics, a real master of illustration. And this book is a kind of structurally stunning book and kind of emotionally potent book as well, which usually big kind of complex formal structures of multiple interwoven stories from different points of view and stuff could be a mess. But this really takes that format to the best extreme of using it to tell emotional stories and using it to tell stories about the complications of people, that people aren't good or bad. They're kind of, depending on who's interacting with them and what the day is and stuff, anything can go any which way. It's also very inspiring to me because it's a big ensemble cast in one, focusing on one city that has all of these different politics and stuff. And it's not a very long book, maybe 100 something pages. This is the kind of thing that I would like to be able to do, but in my mind, to do it the right way, you would have to tell thousands of pages of story. And here, Ellice Weaver is proving to me that you can be emotionally potent in very, very short spaces, because each particular character is only getting 5 pages, I guess, of narrative. But I really feel like I get to know them. And then they show up in other stories in the book as well. So you get these little peeks at them from different angles. And just that potency of being able to compress something that seems so filled with emotional and character-driven detail into such a small amount of space is giving me some hope for pulling off the kinds of things that I would like to do, maybe, hopefully one day. So anyways, we open in Upper Haven, Squaresville. These are just different areas within Something City. This story is about a character named Joe Walker, and Joe Walker's basically moved to a different part of the city because at some point she had freed a dog that had bit someone, and then it bit somebody else, something like that, and then she was held responsible for that. So just dealing with that in her relationship. I don't want to give away too much of the emotional content of each story, just an overview of how this book works and it fits together, because I really, really think people should track this down and buy it. And as you can see, Ellice Weaver's illustrations are amazing. One thing that I especially like, besides the awesome character work, is and the use of just a couple colors here and there. I really, really like the way that Ellice works on this grid with 45s as well. I've been working on a grid a lot with Bound, but not including the 45s. And seeing this with the 45s is like a kind of different approach. And it lends itself to even more complex compositions because there's like two extra vertices that you can work on, kind of. So just love that. Love all of the little, these are like packed full of each character and things going on in these big illustrations. This is the Free Body Culture Club. So here you have a character, Dr. Jin, I believe Dr. Jin. And Dr. Jin is visiting this nudist colony and basically wants to hang out and enjoy her life and enjoy some peace and quiet on a vacation, and is sucked into the more extroverted nature of the other people there. There's a couple other characters that are there that also become important later in the book. Dr. Jin is related to someone else in the book, which I'll explain when I get there. Each one of these characters connects in some other way. This is the Ashford Minimum Security Prison. It's a really very touching story, but also funny, where you have this guy who's growing cactuses to protect himself within the prison, and then makes friends by handing out cactuses as weapons, kind of. But there's a really touching ending to that. Then we get the Brookfield Terrace, and we're introduced to this character here, who's a germaphobe to the extent that she will not leave her house anymore. So another kind of spooky relationship with Bound, which is about a woman who has a real hard time leaving her house for undefined reasons in my book. But here you have someone who's germaphobic. And then the ironic kind of thing is that her parents are two of the characters in the nudist colony. So you can see, even just in that little bit, how Ellice Weaver is building a real deep sense of a character's history. Like, where did she get this germophobia from? It potentially came from growing up with parents who were very loose about this kind of stuff, and or just the implication of how difficult that would be as a family when people are on two opposite ends of the spectrum, even if she wasn't exposed to that lifestyle as a kid, and it's not why she became a germophobic. It still sets up like a really interesting story that could be its own, entire manga series, really, that runs for like 10 volumes. But here, Ellice Weaver is able to pack a similar amount of emotional punch into just 5 pages plus a few other, interactions with other pages here and there. So that's where I find it very inspiring. The Old Network Square. This is about a wealthier part of town, and there's an app. It's a bit of a Black Mirror type episode where there's an app that basically puts a filter on you and makes you look younger and prettier. And a number of people have decided to quit dating in person entirely and only interact through the app, where they can see people as they want to be seen rather than as they are. Pretty bleak vision of the future, but again, an interesting kind of partition of this world, and these characters do interact with other characters as well. Then there's twice in the book where you get a newspaper from something city, and you get to see the characters interacting over time, or how the stories are playing out. So again, another way of compressing a lot of information into a very tight space. Here you get this story that the prison is having riots, and the hostages or the inmates have somehow gotten cactuses to use as weapons, and they can't figure it out. Then here you get a little piece on the Face app and what people are saying about that, and that's juxtaposed right across from the lifestyle article about people who are undressed. And I think just having these two here next to each other is so potent, because you have people who are completely uncomfortable with their body juxtaposed with people who are totally comfortable with their body. And just there's so much content happening in the gutter between those two things, written in between the lines. And that, God, the writing on that, so impressive to me. And putting those two things together says so much. It's like, God, I wish I could be that good. Here's a really fun formal thing. We've got a girl here, and this is her boyfriend who's coming in, and she's talking about a conversation that had happened earlier, and she's saying, or no, this is actually, he's coming in, and their relationship's obviously falling apart, and she's telling her friend about this sequence that happened here. Sorry. So this sequence is one little sequence, and then she's telling the friend about how her boyfriend came home, and she's saying, this is the best book I've ever read. And then the boyfriend says, that's not hard considering you don't read much. I read the back of that book the other day. I thought it sounded a bit lame. And so he's totally being dismissive of her and discouraging of her reading. And then there's this real fun formalism where her and her friend are like pissing on the sidewalk while they're drunk partying, and the piss comes down, and she's basically like urinating on his words. So so much loaded into such a small space. And then you get the next story is the boyfriend from the previous story going and dealing with his father, who's got all this stuff piled up, and he's coming up on dying, and they're thinking about moving him into old people's home and getting rid of his stuff. And so you see that this character, one of the reasons he was probably short and being an asshole in the previous sequence is he's dealing with some really intense stuff himself, and so he's not being as mindful of his relationship as he could be. He's in his own space, and I think that's really, really interesting. Then you also see that they're having an estate sale here, and the nudist mother that you see in the chat and the germaphobe daughter are now out, and they're talking about getting a printer for the new term. You said I could stay home for one more term. You promised you would allow me to take my reintegration slowly. And so here you have this character now being forced to come back out. You get the nudist mom, and there's just these lives touching tangentially for a second and then spreading off. And that's an amazing picture of how reality works. And I've always loved writers who tell that kind of ensemble interwoven. I think my favorite TV show ever is Treme, where all these characters in New Orleans post Katrina are interacting in these ways. And something like this I could see going on forever as well. You could keep playing with these characters, but you don't need to because it's so well written. Here you get one about the Amish community in town. So there's a sister, and she's lamenting the leaving of her sister Martha, who I didn't go back and see where else Martha showed up, but I'm sure she must in the story somewhere else, as she's out in the regular world, not in the community anymore. But she leaves her sister Pokemon cards behind that are kind of like a calling card to say, hey, come join me. Here we get a character, Matthew, who's, I think, shout out to the Matthew from the Eminem song, where the guy drives the girl off the bridge locked in his car, because here this character Matthew's a little crazy, and he's often saying things that don't make sense to people or sounds like he's bragging. And he's saying, I was friends with Eminem. He signed my shirt when I saw him at a concert. And then he's lying about being a genius at the Apple bar. But in his mind, he did something very smart while he was in an Apple bar. And then he comes home and is obviously in a kind of nudist relationship, but still having awkward conversations. Then you get a story that's more focused. Well, here you get a news story that's obviously talking about the dying father from the story about the guy whose father's selling all his stuff at the garage sale. He's doing a bowling league. So this is the other newspaper where you get a sense of the sports. Then we come back to Dr. Jen in her job, and she's treating the woman whose leg was lost after getting bit by the dog that was let out by the Joe Walker character at the beginning of the story. So you get a little bit more of a peek into that character's life and the consequences of this dog being let go. And then you get kind of some of Joe Walker having to deal with that, and then seeing these characters harassing Joe Walker online. And that's where you get this this person is the devil in this person's mind, but when you see it from another character's point of view, this is just someone else who's having their own struggles. And it's not even the woman who's missing the leg who's doing that. It's someone else dealing with her. So just really, really complex interactions that I love in this story. This is my perfect kind of book right here. The illustrations all throughout are amazing, and the structures are amazing. And then here, for people who care to really dive into it, Ellice Weaver has pointed out the relationships of everyone, and even has a key here for their friends, their foes, their lovers, their family, or their acquaintances. And that's really fun too, because you can go through and puzzle the book out even more. Obviously looking at this, I didn't catch all of the relationships that are embedded in there. And this book, unlike the Dan Clowes Monica book, really suggests on the surface of it that the deeper you dive, the more it's going to unfold, because every little bit of clue every bit of connection I did get, it wasn't just I was solving a mystery, but it was I was getting to know people better, and there was incentive to try and get to know the characters even better on a second and a third read. I'm talking to Michael Kennedy. He was talking about the idea of bewilderment, and then that made me think about the idea of bewilderment versus confusion. And this is a book that uses bewilderment, where you're kind of lost, but you can kind of find the threads, and the threads all add up to something, versus what I felt in the Clowes book was just purposeful confusion to keep the readers away from the noticing that the book was hollow, and or pointing towards the fact that the book was hollow as some kind of ironic statement, which is, again, hollow. But this book is a book where all those connections are mapped out. You can follow them, and the deeper you go, the richer the work becomes. So this makes me very, very hopeful that there is a path for telling emotionally rich, complex, ensemble cast stories in a very compressed, short amount of space. And I really, really thank you, Ellice Weaver, for showing a way forward for me, maybe. But God, I don't know I could ever be this good of a writer. Maybe, hopefully, I could be this good of an illustrator, but even that's questionable. So, a beautiful book. I highly recommend it for everyone, as I do recommend Ellice Weaver's newest book, Big Ugly. Definitely go out and get them both. There's some of the best comics I've read this year, if not the best. The Exile by Eric Creek is a gorgeously illustrated Viking saga of revenge. Eric Creek calls it his Viking Western. It's about a guy who's been away on the warpath and is returning home to some family troubles that have to be resolved. And this is told in just this amazing, like, kind of three-color art style that looks like old woodblock cuts or something. It's absolutely gorgeous book that you've got to pick up.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.